Hi there and welcome to Mastering Hard Surface Lesson 2. Firstly, I just want to apologise for my nose being a bit nasally this lesson. That's a result of getting punched in the face a lot the last couple of weeks, and I've been holding off recording the lesson in hopes that it heals up a little bit faster, but that doesn't look like it's going to happen anytime soon, so I'll just get on with it. But moving on from lesson 1, where I showed you the very basic hotkeys and tools that are going to be utilised throughout the course, I can now begin to move on to the fundamentals of the geometry creation and cleaning process. I can't stress enough the importance of cleaning your meshes as you go. So in order to do that, you need to make sure your meshes are as low res as possible. The easiest way we're going to do that is by utilizing the show and result mode while modeling, so you can visualize the final result and know that you're not adding too many edges to your mesh. In later lessons, I'll be covering how to model based from blueprints, and then you'll have a better idea of just how much geometry you need. But in this lesson, I'm going to show you more of a free-flowing modeling process that focuses on the simple laws that keep a mesh clean. So let's get started, and I'll break down my workflow as I go. So when you start a new piece of geometry, the first strip of polygons that you're going to lay out is called the foundation loops. So the foundation loops are the strips of geometry you use as a basis for defining your model's overall shapes and curves. It's ideal to start out really low poly, then add detail in at a later stage. So to begin with, I'm just going to drag out some loops from this initial plane, and because I'm not designing anything specific, I can go with the flow and show you how you can start to shape and mold your object using these loops. So the first thing I always do is I start with the plane and just give it one segment, and then what I might do is I might rotate it. Let's just say I'm modeling a piece of armor or a piece of a mech, like a chest piece or something like that. So the first thing I do is I start out and I'll move the plane into position, and like I was saying in the first lesson, I'm just going to right click, convert it to an editable poly. What I can do next is I can grab the vertices in the center here and move them to 0 in the origin, because what I'm going to do next is I'm going to add a symmetry modifier to this mesh so that when I model on one side, it's also affecting the other side. In order to do that though, because I've just created a plane, even though these vertices are on the center line, the object's pivot isn't. So we need to adjust that. So the easiest way to adjust the object's pivot is to just click this button here, the hierarchy tab, and then go Effect Pivot Only, and then you can just snap this to 0 by writing that in. Now your object's pivot is on that center line, and your vertices are on 0 also. So the next step is to add a symmetry modifier. And now we're going to affect both sides. And you can see if I go in and adjust one side with show and result on, I'm affecting the other side also. That's extremely important when you're modeling things like cars and stuff like that. Okay, so as I was saying, you want to start out with some foundation loops. So what we do is we go to edge mode, and holding shift, that's when I can just drag out new loops. So from that loop, you might drag out another foundation loop. And a really important thing to note here, like I was saying in the first lesson, is when we were talking about those hotkeys, is that if I want to swap the view mode when I'm dragging out, I need to use the hotkey to do that. So I'm going to use Alt and right click, and that's going to bring up this tab for changing the view mode, and which is the same as up here. So usually you'll see here, I want to drag out the loop. I'll just show you quickly. I want to drag out the loop kind of out this direction. So I can do that two ways. If I remained in view mode when dragging out, all I can do is drag out like that. I could technically use the inside loop, the inside screen option, but you can see it's a little bit picky in how I select it. So what I like to do is I use Alt and right click, I swap it to screen mode, and then when I want a free flow, I can just move them wherever I want. So no matter where I move the camera, now all of a sudden I can drag out edge loops in that direction. But for this piece, we'll just keep it a little bit more simple, and I'll just drag out just a kind of semi-rounded shape, and we'll move it up there. And then we've got 2 foundation loops. Now continuing on from there, I can either join these 2 pieces up, and it doesn't matter if I select both edges, I can still drag out in the same way as if I was just using one edge. It doesn't really matter. I could do all 3 if I wanted, and then stitch this together. But what I'm going to do is I'm just going to select this first loop, this last edge, and bring it up to meet this surface up here. And you can see these 2 points aren't matching. So there's a couple of things I can do here. If I go back, I can either bridge the 2 and join them that way, and that's just going to create a little bridge for those 2 pieces. Or I can do it a little bit more freestyle and just drag it out using Shift. And then what I do is if I swap to vertice mode with 1 and then hit Q, I can target weld these 2 pieces together. So on a very simple mesh, it might be easier to bridge, but there'll be times where you don't know exactly what you want, and you might need to like drag in here, for example, and then up, and then we go up again, and then we need to bridge them. But then you're left with, like, if you don't realize what you want at first, you end up having to move them anyway. So what I like to do is I like to just leave that gap there, and then I might move them into place. Knowing that we're still in screen mode here. And then once you've got your kind of mesh where you want it, because now we're separating. At first we were keeping this edge distance the same, and now we're starting to change that. So that's where I do a little bit more detailing work. But still, this base mesh is still extremely low poly. So once again, I can either bridge it or I can join it. It doesn't really matter. Just do whatever you're comfortable with. I don't really have any set, predetermined way of doing it. I'm just going with what I'm going to do subconsciously, because you want to practice enough where all these technical things we're doing in the viewport are second nature, and what you're focusing on is the curves of your mesh. So even though we're not ready yet to get into some design theory stuff, what I mean by that is you don't want to be thinking about, oh, now I need to go into vertice mode, now I need to bridge these 2 polys. You just want to know in your head what result you're after and then push towards that. Obviously that's going to take a lot of practice, but that's the ultimate goal. So now that I've explained the very basics of kind of dragging out these foundation loops, one thing I like to do before I continue is to assign the correct shader to the model. So in the material editor, I'm just going to assign a kind of dark and diffuse shader. You can set it to 60. I like to set the specular level to something like 50 and the glossiness to 25. And now we're going to add a turbo smooth on top. I could have technically done this at the very start, but I just wanted to show you the very basics of dragging those loops out first. So I'll assign 2 turbo smooth iterations, and I'll set it to isoline display. And now I've got a pretty basic idea of what's happening on my mesh. So one annoying thing 3ds Max 2014 introduced is the wireframe being visible on your selected mesh. Those who are only just joining Max won't realize what it was like before. So in order to get it back to how it was, what you need to do is you need to right click this plus box, right click the realistic option, go to configure, and you'll see this display selected with edged faces. So now when I disable that and click the mesh, the wireframe's not coming up. In order to get the wireframe to come up, I have to hit F4, whereas before, if I just go and enable that again, now all of a sudden, no matter what happens, when I select that mesh, the wireframe's showing. And it's really annoying because you don't want to see that all the time. You want to manually be able to choose when you see that, even while you're selecting the mesh. Okay, so you can see we've got a really low-res piece of geometry here, and the importance of that will come later on when you're going to kind of define different shapes and different designs and things like that. You don't want to go in and add so many edge loops that you're making extra work for yourself later on. I'll give you an example of that. So you can see here we've got three edges making up this curve. So when I go to adjust that curve, if I hold Alt and right click and go back to view mode, all I want to do is bring it up or down. Now while I'm modeling, you can see that I'm adjusting the overall shape of these curves. Now the hard part is, and I see it all the time when people are modeling and when they're new to it, they add more geometry than they think than they realize they actually need. So if I go in and select all these loops, I can connect them, and now let's just say I want to change the curvature of this shape. If I go in and I've got all these extra loops, I'm adding so much more time to the process because I've got to go in and select these vertices, move them, select the next set of vertices and move them, when in reality, at the very start of the creation process, I could probably get away with just 2. So I can even go further less detailed and bring this part all the way up to the top here and then work with that as a starting point. So because this mesh is extremely low res, I've made it extremely easy on myself to define the overall shape, and I can do that moving the bare minimum amount of vertices. So moving on from here, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to kind of finish off this shape just very roughly, and then I'll start to show you some of the basic ways of adding support loops to harden off different parts of the mesh. So firstly, I'm just going to go in and target weld these 2 points together. And now you'll see we're left with 3 edges here that we need to connect to fill in this area. So if I go here and bridge these, we're creating a really messy piece of geometry. And if I show the end result, it doesn't look too great. So we need to work as we go and fix this. So what I like to do is when I've got a piece of messy geometry, the easiest way, and I'm just touching base on this will be covered in depth much later on when we're going in to create more advanced shapes and building characters and stuff like that later on in the course. But at this initial phase, I'm just going to touch base on it. And what I like to do is I like to clean up a part. I'll go to the cut tool, which I've set to T, and I'll just cut to where I need it to go. So now I'm continuing this edge loop down, and then I'll remove this loop. So when I select it, if I just hit remove, it's gone. And if I show in result now, it's a little bit cleaner than it was. You can see before it was kind of just bending back here, and it doesn't look great. So once again, I'm just going to get the cut tool, cut along here, and remove these loops. You'll also notice that I'm kind of very quickly shifting between the show and result, the vertice mode, edge mode, and all sorts of things like that. That speed comes with practice, and it's not even fast at the moment. I'm not even trying to model quickly, but for those just starting out, it might seem a little bit quick and you might miss a couple of things. So to make sure you're modeling the same way I am, I need to explain kind of where my fingers are resting on the keyboard. My middle finger is resting on the W key, my ring finger is resting on the A key, and my index finger is on the D key. That's the resting place for where my fingers always are. I use my pinky for control, and I use my thumb for maximizing the viewport. So my fingers don't really move from that location. When I want to use the arc rotate mode, I move my finger off the W key onto the S key. So my middle key goes from the W to the S. All these things might seem basic, but once again, I've seen other people work and not everybody does it. A lot of people, similar to the way some people touch type and other people look at the keys, in a less exaggerated way, I'll see some people just move using their pointer finger to click everything. It's not the fastest way to go about it. Okay, so that's where your hand's always going to go back to rest. I'll provide a little diagram of that with the course, with this lesson, sorry, just so you kind of have a visual guide of where to go. Alright, so moving on. We've added this loop now and it's kind of coming down, and we can continue that down to this point here. So once again, I'm going to go to the cut tool. I'm going to click on this point. Another little important piece of information to note is when you're using that cut tool, you'll see the icon that the cut tool is making at the moment is a kind of square with the little circles around, with the little dots, with the little edges around it. But when I touch a vertice, it shrinks and we're seeing like a little crosshair. So it goes from being a square to a crosshair. When it turns into a crosshair, that's when you know you can click on that vertice and point down to an edge or another vertice. And once again, if you go to an edge or a vertice, it's going to snap and it's going to change the icon. What will happen is, if you're not paying attention to that, is say for example I click here, I've missed it, or if I click here, I've missed that vertice, and now we can see that 3ds Max automatically creates an edge to the closest vertice where you selected it. So if I go back to T and make a cut, you'll see it's going to snap it to this point because that's the closest vertice. If I do it over here, it's going to snap to the closest. You can actually use that later on as a very quick hack for making quicker cuts. So for example, if I wanted to, add points along here, what I can do is I can just start here and move along, knowing that it's going to create that point up there. So all little details like that I'll get into later on in the course, as I'm modeling. But for now, what we want to do is we just want to continue this loop down here. And as I show in result, now you'll see that if I go into the turbo smooth and turn off the isoline display, the geometry is flowing a lot more smoothly. You can see all the loops are flowing in unison. And that is what's going to make things easier for you when you're trying to clean your mesh. If I go back before I made that cut and show you the end result, now you can see 3ds Max is starting to subdivide the mesh in a messier way. That's not to say you can't use that for your benefit, but as a general rule, it's much better to get your geometry flowing as much as possible. If you're having issues visualizing that with isoline display on, it is sometimes good during that initial learning phase to turn the isoline display off while you're making these cuts, because that way you're seeing exactly what the smoothed edge loops are doing. Okay, so we've continued this loop down here. Now what I'm going to do is you'll notice that this little inset here, because I'm just going to create some detail out of this, we can see that we've got a little inset going on here where the geometry is flat and then comes up, but on this point we don't have that. So in order to do that, I can just move it in a little bit. So it's at this point where I need to very briefly explain the importance of using the right camera angles while you're moving your geometry. So if I'm moving this from this angle, I can't exactly see how far in I need to go. It's much harder to gauge where that needs to go. So in order to avoid moving it and then rotating, and then you move it again, and then you rotate, and then you might try to figure out exactly where that should go, and this is just a very basic example of this, the easiest way to do it is to find the correct camera angle and then model from that point. So you only need to move the edge once. So what I'm going to do here is move the camera to a point where I can see exactly how that loop is flowing, and then I can move it down, and now I've got a much better idea of how to keep these even. And you can see we're starting to get a little bit of a shape popping through here. I can go in and I can move these loops, and just make them a little bit cleaner, because you'll notice here on this surface we've got it sticking out, but then it doesn't continue that same curve on the outside. So it goes around and it's not matching here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the correct camera angle and once again just select a couple of bits of geometry and move them into shape. I'm going to select these loops because you can see as we're smoothing down here, the separation becomes a little bit different. So when I move them closer now this loop doesn't come back out, it goes and continues down towards that point of detail where we want to add some beveling later on. We can use that and continue that same process on the rest of the mesh, and you'll see now that we've got a slightly more detailed mesh, but we're still facing some serious issues. One of those is up here, where this vertice, you can see it's even between these two, or it's roughly even. We could technically move that to be a little bit closer, and this is a good example of where I might use the edge constraint toggle if I want to keep it running along that same trajectory. So if I hit the edge constraint, now I can only move it along whatever edge I'm dragging it based on. So if I turn that off, I can move it everywhere, but once again with it on, I might just want to move that in so it's just in the middle of those 2 points. The same thing goes for this back point. If you look at the smooth result, and I might need to just add a couple of edge loops here for you to see the importance of it. We've got some, you can see these polygons here are a lot smaller than these ones in the center. And that's because we don't have an even distribution. So to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the correct camera angle. Once again, I'm going to use Alt and right click to swap to screen. And then I'm just going to move it so that it's roughly in the middle here. And what that will do is that's going to now create a much more even distribution of polygons. And you can see there you go, it's much more even. And the mesh, you're making it so much easier for 3ds Max to produce a clean result doing this. Every single vertice on your mesh, you need to be aware of that and look for those problems. So when I first started, a common mistake people make is, and these are mistakes you only really make once, but I've just left it in there just so you know. When you're working in 3ds Max's modifier stack, which I haven't touched base on yet, it's extremely powerful. I'll go into this in another lesson because there's so much you can do in this stack. The basics is you need to have the turbo smooth over the top. So now what we're doing is, if I have that underneath the symmetry, it's saying smooth this mesh as if it was on its own and then add the symmetry to it. Whereas if I add the symmetry underneath, it's creating this new piece of geometry and then it's saying smooth this piece of geometry. So if I drag them over the top, you can see the difference in the center here. It's just going to create this weird pinch. So to avoid that, once again, just drag the turbo smooth to the top. So I can continue on now, and if you remember what I was saying about keeping that distribution of polygons even, what I could do is I could get all these loops, and I'm just going to turn off the the edge constraint, and drag these into shape. You can see this polygon starting to stretch out. And for all intents and purposes, that may just be the way the mesh is designed. But when you're free flow modeling and when you're modeling without reference, without any preset design, it's good to abide by these laws. So when I drag this in now, this point, that's another little thing I should note. What happens sometimes is when you're in Max, it produces a little bit of a bug where no matter what I do when I press F3 or F4, it's not swapping back to the wireframe and shaded view mode. So what you need to do is you just need to go up here and manually bring that back. So I've dragged these in, and you can see now we're starting to get something that looks a little bit more like a hard surface shape. But the problem is now when I've done that is I've readjusted the distribution of polys so that